I said hold it down.
They don't like him, Jess.
Why did so many wrestlers hate working with Rick Rude? Well, it wasn't just about his attitude outside the ring. His feuds, backstage drama, and some wild behind-the-scenes moments made things even messier. And trust us, some of these stories are crazier than you'd ever expect. One of the most infamous examples of that happened during his feud with Jake the Snake Roberts. Now keep in mind, Jake was already a deep, mysterious, and intense character. So when he and Rude clashed, fans were hooked. But what most people didn't know was just how personal things got. You see, during their rivalry, Rude had an idea to bring Jake's real-life wife, Cheryl Roberts, into the storyline. The plan was for her to appear on camera and be part of a segment where Rude would try to kiss her, just like he did with other women during his entrances. That whole ravishing routine, where he'd insult the crowd and then make out with a woman at ringside, was part of what made him a top heel. But trying to include Cheryl? That took things to a whole new level. She wanted no part of it, and who could blame her? Even though she refused to go along with it initially, the storyline moved forward in a way that made things extremely uncomfortable. At one point during a heated segment, Cheryl actually ended up slapping Rude in what looked like a scripted moment. But according to some, that slap was 100% real. There was legitimate tension behind the scenes. Jake wasn't exactly thrilled about his wife being dragged into the wrestling world for the sake of a feud, and the whole thing added a layer of real-life anger to an already intense storyline. And this wasn't a one-off situation. Rude had a habit of going too far when it came to blurring the lines between fiction and reality. His gimmick was built around being arrogant, seductive, and completely over the top. He'd walk to the ring slowly, flex his muscles, grab the microphone, and insult every man in the audience, usually saying they were fat, out of shape, and nowhere near as good-looking as him. Then with that smug grin, he'd pick out a woman from the crowd, hand-picked by his manager Bobby the Brain Heenan, and plant a long, showy kiss on her in the middle of the ring. It was designed to get under people's skin, and it definitely worked. But looking back, it's easy to see how this kind of act walked a fine line. Even in its own era, some thought it went a bit too far. Today, it would probably be seen as inappropriate or even offensive. But back then, it was all about getting heat, and Rick Rude excelled at that. Still, when the cameras stopped rolling, Rude wasn't exactly everyone's favorite guy in the locker room. And if there's one person who had a serious problem with him, it was the Ultimate Warrior. Their rivalry in the ring looked like a natural fit. Rude had the mic skills and wrestling ability. Warrior had the energy and larger-than-life charisma. But behind the scenes, things were ugly. According to several stories from people who were there, Rude didn't respect Warrior one bit. He thought Warrior was careless in the ring, unprofessional, and way too full of himself. And from Rude's point of view, Warrior hadn't earned the right to be acting like a top guy when he was putting others at risk with his sloppy style. Now, it's not uncommon for wrestlers to have some tension, but the bad blood between Rude and Warrior went deeper than just personality clashes. There were real physical altercations between them backstage. In fact, there's one story that's been told over and over about how Rude actually beat up Warrior in the locker room after a match. Apparently, Rude had had enough of Warrior being stiff in the ring, throwing careless strikes, botching moves, and not looking out for his opponent's safety. One night, things boiled over. After the match ended and they went backstage, Rude confronted Warrior, and it turned into a full-on fight. People say Rude didn't just talk tough, he actually handled Warrior physically, proving that he wasn't someone to mess with. Even though they continued working together on screen, that tension never really went away. And it was clear to many that Rick Rude was one of the few guys who wasn't afraid to stand up to Warrior, even if it meant risking his own spot in the company. But this was classic Rick Rude. He didn't care about playing politics. He didn't suck up to management. He believed in hard work, being professional, and respecting the business. And when someone didn't follow that code, he let them know, sometimes with his fists. All of this contributed to the complicated legacy of Rick Rude. On one hand, he was a brilliant performer who knew how to get a crowd to hate him. He had one of the best physiques in wrestling and carried himself like a true star. But on the other hand, he didn't always know when to dial it back. He burned bridges, he made enemies, and he didn't always work well with others. Now let's turn our attention to his wrestling career. Before he ever stepped foot in the squared circle, Rick Rude, real name Richard Rude, was just a guy from Minnesota trying to figure out his path. After graduating from Anoka Ramsey Community College with a degree in physical education, he worked for a bit as a bouncer. He also dabbled in arm wrestling for a short while, which gave him his first taste of showmanship and competition. That's when he decided to chase something bigger: professional wrestling. Rude trained under the legendary Eddie Sharkey, who also trained big names like the Road Warriors, Bob Backlund, and Sean Waltman. By 1982, he had officially entered the wrestling world under the name Ricky Rude. Back then, he was just another babyface jobber trying to get by, losing matches and learning the ropes. He made his TV debut on November 6, 1982, on Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, where he lost to Jos LeDuc. Not exactly a blazing start, but every star has to begin somewhere. From there, Rude wrestled across different territories, first in Vancouver's NWA All-Star Wrestling, then Georgia Championship Wrestling, and later Memphis's Continental Wrestling Association. By 1983, he showed up on World Championship Wrestling TV and got his first win, defeating Pat Rose with a dropkick. During a post-match interview with Gordon Solie, Rude talked about how he shifted from arm wrestling to pro wrestling and trimmed down to improve his speed. He wasn't flashy yet, but the confidence was already building. By 1984, Rude had returned to Memphis, this time rebranded as Ravishing Rick Rude. Gone was the humble rookie. In his place stood a cocky, arrogant heel managed by the loud and wild Jimmy Hart. This new version of Rude was gaining attention fast. He feuded with Jerry the King Lawler and later went toe-to-toe with his former partner, King Kong Bundy. You could tell Rude had found his groove. Later that year, Rude started making waves in championship wrestling from Florida. Managed by Percy Pringle, who fans would later know as Paul Bearer, Rude won his first major title in January 1985, beating Pez Whatley for the NWA Florida Southern Heavyweight Championship. He lost it in April, won it again in July, and had a decent run before dropping it in October to Wahoo McDaniel, who was also booking the territory at the time. He also teamed with Jesse Barr to win the Florida tag titles, adding more gold to his resume. Then came a big step forward. In late 1985, Rude joined World Class Championship Wrestling alongside Percy Pringle. This was during the hot Texas territory run, where he feuded with Kevin Von Erich and Chris Adams. Rude quickly became the NWA American Heavyweight Champion in November 1985. But here's where things got interesting. WCCW pulled out of the NWA in early 1986 and renamed their top title the WCWA World Heavyweight Championship. Because Rude was already holding the belt, he instantly became the promotion's first world champion. That was a big deal. He'd eventually drop the title to Chris Adams and later team up briefly with a young Dingo Warrior, who, plot twist, would later become the Ultimate Warrior. By 1986, Rude was back in Jim Crockett Promotions, teaming with Manny Fernandez as part of the Awesome Twosome, managed by Paul Jones. The two won the NWA World Tag Team Championships in December of that year by defeating the Rock and Roll Express, a huge victory at the time. But Rude didn't stick around long. By April 1987, he had signed with the World Wrestling Federation, and Crockett had to use a pre-taped match and a fake injury storyline to write him off TV. In WWF, Rude joined Bobby Heenan's infamous Heenan family and kicked things off with a feud against Paul Orndorff. That quickly led to Rude taking on the biggest names in the company. He challenged Hulk Hogan for the WWF Championship in early 1988, but didn't win. Then came his legendary feud with Jake the Snake Roberts, the same one where real-life tensions spilled into the storyline, and Rick got slapped by Cheryl Roberts, Jake's real-life wife. By now, Rude's persona was fully developed. He insulted male fans, called them fat, out-of-shape sweat hogs, and then kissed women handpicked from the audience after every match. His airbrushed tights became his signature. Sometimes they even had the faces of his opponents' loved ones on them. This gimmick, while controversial, made Rude one of the most hated villains in the business. In 1989, Rude had one of his biggest career moments when he beat the Ultimate Warrior at WrestleMania 5 to become Intercontinental Champion, thanks to a little help from Bobby Heenan. But Warrior got his revenge at SummerSlam later that year, winning the title back after interference from Roddy Piper. Rude then feuded with Piper for a bit and even had a short program with Jimmy Snuka. When Warrior became WWF champion in 1990, Rude went after him again. This time he ditched the flashy tights and long hair for a more serious look, even trimming his hair short. Their feud ended in a steel cage match at SummerSlam 1990, where Warrior walked out with the win. Rude was then set to feud with Big Boss Man, but that angle got cut short after Rude made some controversial on-air comments. In real life, he had a falling out with Vince McMahon and was suspended, then quietly left the company. After leaving WWF, Rude briefly explored other promotions like Herb Abrams' UWF and Tri-State Wrestling. He even had a run in Japan in 1991 with All Japan Pro Wrestling, where he stayed undefeated in singles matches. He also popped up in IWCCW for a short stint. By late 1991, Rude was back on a national stage, this time in WCW. He debuted under a mask as the Phantom at Halloween Havoc, then unmasked that same night. He soon aligned with Paulie Dangerously's Dangerous Alliance, which included stars like Arn Anderson, Bobby Eaton, and a young, stunning Steve Austin. Rude beat Sting for the U.S. Championship in November 1991 and held it for nearly 14 months, a reign that remains one of the longest in the belt's history. In late 1992, Rude injured his neck and had to vacate the title. He returned in 1993 and feuded with Dustin Rhodes for the U.S. Championship, but couldn't win it back. So he set his sights on Ric Flair and the WCW International World title. Rude beat Flair in September 1993 at Fall Brawl, won and lost the belt a few times, including a short reign in Japan, and eventually dropped it to Sting in April 1994. In their rematch, Rude took a bad fall during a dive spot and injured his back badly enough to retire. Rude collected on an insurance policy and stayed out of wrestling until 1997, when he returned in ECW under a mask. He had fun messing with Shane Douglas and even had one match, only to turn on his partners. That same year, he returned to WWF as part of D-Generation X, acting as the group's insurance policy. But after the infamous Montreal Screwjob, Rude quit again, this time on principle. He was so angry about what happened to Bret Hart that he showed up live on WCW Nitro the same night he was taped on WWF Raw. It was a wild moment. Rude appeared on both shows in the same night with two different looks. He joined the NWO and WCW, managing Curt Hennig and taking part in the group's split between the Wolfpack and Hollywood factions. But injuries and health issues took him off TV by late 1998. By April 1999, Rude had quietly left WCW for good. That's it for today's video. Make sure to like and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.